Shalom, I'm Jonathan Hassan, and this is yet another edition of TV7 Editor's Note. Today with me in the studio is a dear friend and colleague, Colonel Richard Kemp, who is the former chairman of Cobra Military, or the Intelligence Committee of Cobra, as well as the commander of British forces in Afghanistan. I won't go into the entire list, Colonel, because ultimately your curriculum vitae is quite impressive. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here in Jerusalem.
Well, the pleasure and honor is all mine. Let's open initially with prayers. We always do in this program, and then we'll communicate more about the situation, both here in Israel, in our region, and beyond. Thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to have Colonel Kemp here with me in the studio. Father, Lord, I pray that you'll bless this program, bless our viewers all over the world, that they may benefit from today's production, that you will grant us clarity of mind and wittiness to our tongues, so we may truly be fruitful in all that we do. We give you all glory and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Obviously, a co-panelist of TV7 Europa stands. Later this week, we're actually going to be in Helsinki, from all places, to communicate about the variables that have to do with Europe. So we'll keep Europe outside of today's episode as much as possible, even though I think it's there is no disconnect between the fact that Russia is heavily involved here in the region. There's also mounting criticism on Israel regarding a lack of offensive weaponry being delivered to Ukraine. I'd like to hear your perspectives on this, but I don't think most people at home understand what Cobra actually is. Could you explain a little bit your past positions? What do these entail?
Yeah, whenever there's a national emergency or a national crisis of some sort, whether it's inside the UK or overseas, whether it could be a war, it could be a kidnapping, a terrorist attack, something of that sort, then Cobra meets to consider the UK government's response to that situation. Sometimes it also meets on the basis of intelligence that indicates a crisis or some kind of attack is going to happen. And it's essentially chaired by the Prime Minister and made up mainly of cabinet ministers. And my function within that committee was to chair the intelligence group, which is made up of the National Intelligence Services, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, Defence Intelligence, and Police Intelligence, in support of Cobra, to make sure Cobra has the up-to-date picture and to take Cobra's future intelligence requirements and transmit them to the intelligence services. So it's a pretty fundamental aspect of the British government dealing with crises.
You've of course, received a lot of praise by all Western countries for the instrumental participation of Cobra in the war of Ukraine, in its defense against the Russian invasion. To what degree is Cobra the forefront of this?
Cobra is an extremely important element of the UK's response, because anything that involves cross-government cooperation on a military or a defense or security or a crisis basis, that's, Cobra coordinates. So, of course, in terms of direct support to Ukraine, military support, the Ministry of Defence is in the lead there. But there's many more aspects than that. There's the intelligence services heavily involved in the Ukraine war as well. There is, of course, the question of refugees coming out of Ukraine into the UK, which affects the Home Office. There's the sanctions on Ukraine, which the Treasury are involved in, and all other government departments as well. So it brings the whole coordination of government in support of Ukraine's fight against Russia.
Very good. Obviously, the sanctions upon Russia, particularly here. Let's draw in and communicate more about our theater here. Israel has been vigorously involved in an ongoing battle against terrorism. You've been instrumental in past capacities in this war against terror, and I'd like to hear your perspective on the latest Operation Wavesbreaker taking place in the West Bank districts, Judea, Samaria, Jordan Valley, of course, also included. To what degree do you see this being vital in Israel protecting its rear ahead of potential conflagration beyond its borders?
Mm. I should say we spoke about intelligence cooperation between Britain and Israel, and I was heavily involved in that, as well as with other countries' cooperation with Britain on intelligence. And I think it's true to say that the relationship, the intelligence relationship, as well to maybe a slightly lesser extent the defence relationship, but certainly the intelligence relationship between Britain and Israel is absolutely unique in the extent of the cooperation that exists, and I think the volume of exchange of intelligence. And I think that our two countries, Britain and Israel, depend extremely heavily on each other when it comes to countering threats and preempting threats against our two countries on a very, very wide scale. And I know for sure that many British lives have been saved by Israeli intelligence supplied to the UK. And I've little doubt the same applies in the opposite direction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that's, I'm not suggesting that that British intelligence is directly involved in the current counter-terrorist operations in Judea and Samaria and elsewhere, but there is a long-standing and extant cooperation, which maybe does contribute to what's going on there. I don't know. But it is that Operation Wavebreaker is a very significant operation. And we saw over the last number of months, we saw a big uprise, a big surge in terrorist attacks, particularly coming from Judea and Samaria against Israelis. And it was essentially it was a continuation of what had been going on before, but much, much more significant, I think. And one of the most significant factors is that the terrorists involved in it, there was obviously very close connections between them and terrorists in Gaza. But the terrorists involved, many of them have been from people who've actually been either trained by or currently working for the Palestinian Authority security services, which is very troubling. And many of the weapons they use are weapons that were supplied to them in that capacity. And the training and the skills that they bring were given to them, including by British who were involved in training the Palestinian Authority security forces. That all of that has been utilized by these terrorists, which has made them, I think, more effective than they otherwise would have been. And they're not, they're not really under any influence, I don't think, from the Palestinian Authority itself, which is very worried about what's going on there. And we've seen repeated successes by the IDF, by the Israeli Security Authority, the Shin Bet, and other agencies. We've seen how successful they've been in curtailing these attacks. I think the attacks are still going on, but they'd be far worse if it wasn't for this success, which a lot of the time is down, probably 99.9% of the time is down to having very good intelligence. But it's a tough war. And, I think only a few days ago we saw a young girl killed in one of the operations in Jenin, I believe it was. And, of course, the immediate outcry is this is the IDF killing innocent civilians, deliberately killing innocent civilians. Of course, it isn't that at all. And, I don't know who killed this girl, whether it was, in fact, the Israeli security forces or whether it was Palestinians. We don't know. She was on a rooftop. There was no doubt crossfire involved. So far, the facts are unknown about it. But, of course, the immediate reaction is to condemn the IDF.
Condemning, of course, emanating from people who have never set foot in a battlefield and have no idea what it entails, which is always quite upsetting to me personally. But, one of the things, and I've been communicating a lot with different people on the field, and they've mentioned time and again that many of the Palestinian casualties are actually casualties from Palestinian fire. A lot of friendly fire. They're so tense from the fact that any second, any moment, the Israeli units, which are special operations units, obviously much more capable than those Palestinian militants in the field, that they may mistaken or realize that they might come from one direction or another and start shooting and sometimes kill their own men and sometimes injure their own men. Do you see this? Obviously, you had your own report on the Gaza situation where the Islamist Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad actually killed more of their own men than they managed to kill Israelis. Was that correct?
Yeah, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas rockets killed more Palestinian civilians in Gaza than they killed the Israelis they were supposed to be firing at by a significant amount. And that's not unusual. I mean, I think this is the first time it's been much greater number, but in the past we've seen their rockets fired from Gaza, killing a lot of their people. So it's a not unusual situation. And I think, you know, the blue in general terms, blue on blue is or friendly fire, fratricide, whatever you want to call it, is it's a much misunderstood phenomenon. Of course, immediately, if you're talking about a battle between Western security forces, whether Israeli, British, or whatever, and there's an innocent civilian killed, the people they're fighting, whether it's Hamas, whether it's any terrorist group in Israel, or
which are designated terrorist organizations by the international community,
exactly,
majority,
or whether it's the Taliban in Afghanistan or Al Qaeda or Islamic State, they are geared to make sure that their opponents, the Western security forces, are blamed for whatever happens. Mm-hmm. The one thing, in terms of an example of that, I think, is the Shireen Abu Akleh killing. Now, immediately, Israel was blamed for that, and a bullet was produced to prove that Israel did it. Well, of course, that bullet proves absolutely nothing, and I would say there's an equal likelihood, or perhaps even a greater likelihood, that that journalist was killed by Palestinian terrorists than she was by the IDF. But that's not the agenda. The agenda's got to be, and the international media has got to make sure that Israel is blamed for it, whoever did it.
Right.
But the overall phenomenon of blue on blue is an interesting one because, I've been involved in the blue on blue between British forces shooting at each other. And one thing that always surprises me is how infrequently this occurs. It occurs quite a bit, but it should happen more. And the reason I say that is because a battlefield is such a confused place with so many different people moving around. Without, you don't necessarily even know where your own troops are, never mind where the enemy is. There's smoke, there's fire, there's dust, there's, people are very tired a lot of the time, there's confusion, and it amazes me we don't get more of this sort of thing. But we do, of course, get it, and the IDF have friendly fire. It's very rare that you'll find someone saying, oh, the IDF deliberately killed their own soldier in that situation, which occurred as a result of mistake. But of course, if as a result of a mistake, which does happen, they kill an uninvolved civilian, then they immediately get accused of doing it deliberately. So it's a misunderstood and often exploited phenomenon of battle.
What can Israel do to better explain itself in such a scenario?
It's often, again, because of the confusion of war, it's often very difficult to be able to establish the facts quickly, and that's the important thing, that the facts are established as quick as possible, because you can be certain that Israel's enemies will make accusations, founded or unfounded, immediately. And it's very hard if Israel, for example, tries to counter that straight away, and it turns out on further investigation that they were mistaken, and they say, we didn't do it, but actually it turns out they did. So that's something they have to grapple with.
Right.
But a lot of the time, the facts never come out. And, in the case of, for example, uninvolved civilian in a Palestinian area getting killed, the body's gone. There's no time for any examination of the body to get forensic evidence or anything like that. The body's gone and then buried very quickly afterwards. So it's extremely hard. I think the only, when in a normal situation of violence, let's say inside a city or something, but not in a war, then the determination as to responsibility comes from forensic evidence, and that's obviously not often possible in war. So the only way of doing it is by surveillance and by CCTV, etc., and that's again a very difficult thing. So I would say that, obviously Israel can try hard to make sure that a battlefield they're involved in is covered as much as possible by surveillance, as much as, obviously that's important for operations, but also for post-incident investigation. But you're never going to have a perfect situation. You're never going to be able to resolve this problem.
Obviously, Shireen Abu Akleh, she worked for a company, Al Jazeera, which is funded and owned by the biggest backer of the Muslim Brotherhood. Speaking, of course, specifically about Qatar, which hosts members of the internationally recognized terrorist organization Hamas, and directs and funds also Hamas to a certain degree. And now we see Al Jazeera, which is defaming Israel in every capacity possible, trying to take Israel to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, even though Israel is not a signatory of the Rome Statute. And we see that same country, Qatar, being exposed for deliberately bribing and actually putting in its pocket a lot of European politicians, exclusively from the radical left and progressive movements in Europe, which are, quite frankly, pretty much the sector that is anti-Israel within the context of Europe. How does all of this basically clear up, and how can we actually bring the truth up and say, you know what, we need to deal with those organizations trying to influence Western societies in order to attack Israel, because they're quite frankly aware that they're not able to beat Israel straight on.
Yeah, and I think an interesting development is the one you mentioned of bribery and corruption within the European Union.
And we'll talk about this more obviously later this week.
Indeed, but I think you can't afford to be saying that kind of corruption and influence. And if you look at it, the World Cup going on now in Qatar is not a natural destination for the World Cup. It had to involve some kind of influence. I won't go any further than saying that, but some kind of, I think, undue influence on the people.
There have been a lot of allegations of corruption and bribery.
Indeed,
absolutely.
Yeah, indeed. So, I don't think you can ignore that. And as you can't ignore what's going on with the EU at the moment, with things being exposed now, the huge corruption. And then you can't disconnect that from the fact that, for example, right now the EU, not only is the EU mounting a long-term propaganda campaign against Israel, the EU is, I think, one of the most important organizations involved in trying to undermine Israel and trying to criminalize the state of Israel, and indeed themselves. It ranges from that kind of propaganda through to funding illegal settlement activity by Palestinians in Israeli territory.
Right.
Illegal. And they know it's illegal, yet they still will do it. So you have to look at that organization with great, great suspicion. And I think, the key thing, obviously there are diplomatic issues with Israel directly exposing and accusing European and Western countries, in many cases, who have friendly relations with Israel on the surface. And it's difficult for Israel to make accusations. But I think countries like Britain, who I hope more than the EU as an institution, for example, and perhaps more than some other European countries, have a responsibility to play a significant role on Israel's behalf, not as agents of Israel, but as a country that supports Israel, that wants to see Israel flourish. And only a few days ago, our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said that he would personally be working as hard as he could to help ensure Israel's security. Therefore, I think we have a responsibility to expose and to uncover and to try and put an end as much as we can to this malicious and malign influence coming out of particularly Qatar, but other countries as well, into Europe.
Absolutely. Not to forget that Qatar has been blockaded. It's been shunned out of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's been in loggerheads with Saudi Arabia for quite some time. And the Americans managed to try and resolve that issue for their own interests, of course. But then Qatar also became a major non-NATO ally of the United States under the Biden administration, which I find quite odd because the Biden administration has been promoting itself as the champion of human rights. Well, it has nothing to do with human rights when we're talking about engaging in such a relationship. Nonetheless, we have roughly 6 minutes, and I'd like to hear your perspective, also as the commander, the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been once again flourishing with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has once again manifested itself, if we thought, or if it's been promoted, that the Islamic State, Wilayat Khorasan, the district of Khorasan in Afghanistan, is a separate entity of Al-Qaeda. Well, apparently, these are relatives, those are families. They might serve a different master, but, they have grand schemes and strategies that ultimately align themselves, and they have the same aspirations. Are we expected to see more coming out of that part of the world, threatening the West, the Christian world for that matter?
I think it was entirely predictable from the time that President Biden announced his withdrawal from Afghanistan, that leaving basically a security vacuum there was going to result in the rise of Al-Qaeda and other Islamic extremists in that country, as we saw before 9/11, which is the reason we were in there, to prevent that happening. And successfully, I think, the Afghanistan campaign was not a success in every respect. It was a failure in many respects, but one of its successes was it did prevent Afghanistan from again becoming a major base of operations for Al-Qaeda or other jihadists to attack the West. When we left there, it was inevitable this was going to happen again. And of course, Pakistan has a major role in Afghanistan. Pakistan helped to promote and to support the Taliban fighting against the West in Afghanistan, and is now perhaps the major or one of the major players in Afghanistan, China being another major player. And of course, Iran has its fingers in the pie, and Iran helped also, as did China, and Russia helped support Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan fighting against the
So it's
West.
basically part of strategic competition.
Very much so. And I think, so I think the answer to your question really is we can and we should expect to see this flourishing again in that country. And we can't do a huge amount about it because we've withdrawn most of the assets, or perhaps all of the assets that we could have used to counter this.
So Qatari guarantees were not sufficed?
Sorry?
Qatari guarantees?
I don't think necessarily we can count them as rock solid. And incidentally, it was a major strategic failure, a bad strategic decision to pull out. I believe that not only did that decision result in Afghanistan becoming a much greater threat to the West than it's been for many years now, but it also, I think, was directly responsible for Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, because he saw the strategic weakness of not just the United States, but NATO, because it was a NATO operation, of course. And he saw that, and he understood that if he went into Ukraine, NATO would not be willing to oppose him directly. And that's proved, of course, to be the case. Of course, NATO's been very helpful in many different ways, countering Russia, but they haven't directly opposed him. So I think that, that decision to withdraw from Afghanistan had untold strategic consequences, and I haven't mentioned, and I'm not going to bang on because I know we're running short of time, but not least China. Of course, President Xi was watching exactly what happened in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, we have roughly 3 minutes left, and I'd like to hear your take on, there has been growing criticism of Israel for not providing Ukraine with the Iron Dome, even though I don't know exactly how the Iron Dome would help in such a situation. Is there a disconnect between the understanding that a multi-layered system or multiple systems within multiple layers are necessary to be able to truly protect Ukraine, which is vastly larger, territorially speaking, with strategic depth than what Israel has and is able to offer?
Yeah, I think it's people look at Israel and they see the effectiveness in the last few conflicts emanating from Gaza in particular of the Iron Dome, and they think the Iron Dome is the answer to everything. Of course, Israel has a multi-layered air defense system, and One thing I would say is that the Ukrainians have been very effective so far at countering these missiles and drones provided by Iran in some cases, and shooting them down. Not 100%, of course, and they've suffered huge damage because they haven't been. But of course, they want more. They want more, and the West should be providing them more. NATO countries should be providing them more. Israel's been criticised for not doing so. I think that criticism is false because, there's a number of reasons. I think one of the most important reasons is that if Israel was to provide some of its air defense systems to Ukraine, Israel doesn't have air defense systems just hanging around doing nothing.
Right. Yeah.
They're needed to defend this country, and Israel would be wrong, in my view, to make itself more exposed by helping a friendly country like Ukraine. And the other thing that people should be aware of is that Israel is doing a huge amount under the radar to help Ukraine, an amount that most of us will never know about. But despite that aside, I think we would underestimate what Israel's doing if we ignore that.
Well, obviously, we're not going to confirm or deny anything, but obviously, Russia has been allowing itself to become increasingly close to Iran and has been promising a lot of promises to the Islamic Republic with regard to bolstering its capabilities in the region in exchange also for the weaponry. But this leeway that the Russians are allowing themselves comes because this alleged Israeli support under the radar. This is all the time that we have for today, Colonel. Thank you so very much for taking out of your busy schedule to be part of today's episode of TV7 Editor's Note.
Been my pleasure.
And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well for taking of your time to participate in today's discussion with Colonel Kemp. Fascinating indeed. And we will be once again in the same, a different panel, different country also in Helsinki for TV7 Europa Stands, which will air on Thursday evening. So stay tuned for more on the geostrategic situation of Europe, but also implications that are going to have on Jerusalem and on Israel. But until next time, shalom.
We are about to lose the young people. They want a vision. They want to see solutions which may help them to believe that there is a future for them.
Are we succumbing in a slippery slope road to the major crisis? I don't know.
The key issue is leadership and also maybe a lack of national self-confidence.